there! I thought I would take you on a little tour of my sewing room today. Before we get started, I will say this. I am a person who is fascinated with seeing the spaces where people create. I just love seeing the materials they use, but most importantly, I'm really interested in how people organize those spaces. I find that some people are just naturally organized, and then there's me. Somebody who is not, who really has to work on. I'm going to share with you my sewing room, some of my favorite things to use, especially if you're a person who's getting started with sewing or looking to get started on a sewing journey, but also I'm going to share with you how I choose to organize things. So let's take a tour of my sewing room.
I take you around my sewing room. One thing I failed to mention is that I've been sewing for probably about 10 years. And so it's never too late to start learning how to do something new. I'd always wanted to learn how to sew. I'd had a sewing machine actually sitting in a box for 2 years before opening it and trying it out myself. If this is something that you've always had a burning desire to do it.
This right here is where I store all of my fabric. Okay, so fabric is like where I fell in love with sewing. Well, mostly I just fell in love with fabric, and then sewing became the vehicle for which I could buy more fabric. I found fabric probably the first time just by hitting the thrift store, and I would find these beautiful prints of bolts of fabric, and not even owning a sewing machine, I would start to buy this fabric. The other thing that I loved to buy were vintage sheets, especially flat sheets, because it had this great print on it. You could get tons of yardage. This is currently where I keep all of my fabric. Obviously, it's a lot, and I love having it hung on hangers. Previously, I used to have it in stacks, but I noticed what was difficult about that was just if I always inevitably wanted the piece of fabric that was at the bottom, I would have to pull and tug to get it out. Having it hung really helps me be able to see everything. It also helps to keep everything kind of like nice and neat and flat without getting too wrinkled, even though things are a little bit mushed in here. So inside this closet, there's shelves right here, and on the shelves, I do keep even more fabric, and that's where I have vintage sheet collection. And you can see I have quite a bit. So if you're getting started, like on your sewing journey, you might want to hit the thrift store and just look for vintage sheets. You would not believe how fun and adorable some of those prints are that can be found. So I thought I would share with you some of my favorite fabric. I love vintage print. The color and the print, I die. Oh, you gotta see this one. First of all, look at the cute little circus animals. Oh, would this not make the best skirt? Like the best. I've had my student artwork printed on fabric too, and one of them was made into a dress for an art show. I just think it's so stinking adorable. It reminds me of the Beatles. I just love it, and the print is huge. Would you look at it? It's like bark cloth too. Bark cloth. So what is the biggest frustration when it comes to sewing? I think it's the sewing machine. I think that people fear the needle. They think that there's going to be a needle that goes through your finger. It's not going to happen. I mean, it's not happened to me. And if it's not happened to me, then the likelihood of it happening to you are very, very slim. The other thing I think that scares people is the bobbin. You fear that little metal windy thing. I've even seen in sewing machine stores or like sewing fabric, whatever in a stores, that they sell pre-wound bobbins. Y'all don't do that. It's not that hard. But I think that the reason people feel like it is because there's a lot of sewing machines out there that truly suck. Get yourself a good one. Now, that doesn't mean you have to spend a whole lot of money. The machine that I love, that has been just a workhorse for me, and I've never had issue with it, is my Brother sewing machine. When I bought it, it was about $130 at your local superstore. This is not an endorsement. I don't work with Brother. I have a Brother, but this ain't it. I would strongly recommend it. I think it's helpful to have a backup machine in case something goes wrong with your machine. So on this shelf, I do have a couple of other machines you might see. I do have a serger. Talk about something that will get you to like not enjoy sewing. If you want to like really not enjoy sewing, get you a serger. I spend more time on YouTube trying to figure out this doggone serger. Henceforth, the desk. The other machine I have on the shelf that's not a sewing machine is actually a needle felting machine. I'm really into needle felting, and I've got a lot of that to share with you here in my sewing room. So that's why I've got myself a needle felting machine. Share with you what's on the bottom shelf. So I said the thing that got me into sewing was the fabric. Okay, so that's only partially true. What really got me into sewing were the patterns. namely the picture on the front of the pattern. I remember it like it was yesterday. I used to, when I was in college of my sophomore year, I stayed in this blue house with some of my favorite people for the summer. And there was a Goodwill, and I would take my bike and ride down to the Goodwill. And there was one day that I just found a ton of 1950s dress patterns. I didn't have a sewing machine. I didn't know how to sew. I did love vintage clothing at the time. And in particular, I loved the look of 1950s clothing. But I just fell in love with the covers of these patterns. And so I just started collecting them. I have all of my patterns down here, and I actually have them organized by decade.
The biggest thing that kept me away from sewing for the longest time were the sewing patterns. I mean, it just seemed like hieroglyphics all over the back, and even just unfolding it and trying to figure it out. Let me just say this. If you're wanting to learn how to sew and you're wanting to use patterns that are created now that you can find in your local big box stores are so much easier to read and understand. Not only that, but if you get on YouTube and type in the pattern number, oftentimes you'll have people walking you through from start to finish how to complete one of these patterns. And honestly, it's just one of those things that once you learn how to do it, you're going to realize, why did I wait so long? It's really not that hard. And if anything, you can just buy these beautiful patterns for the gorgeous artwork on the cover. And that's probably why I have such a huge stash of these 1950s patterns. I even have patterns all the way up until current ones. They're a lot of fun. These I keep organized, like I said, by decade, and then keep them on that shelf. It helps to keep them in bins to keep bugs out.
I forgot to inform you that my sewing room is not like cute decorated.
So I have a lot of stuff, and I have a lot of like project examples and a ton of examples from when I was teaching and also from writing my book Stitch and String Lab for kids. And I don't get rid of stuff because a lot of times I use those examples in workshops or whatever. But the problem was storing them. I had a lot of cute baskets. The problem with baskets is they're round. They don't fit on shelves very well. And so ultimately what I decided to do was scrap the cuteness and make this as functional as possible. So I readjusted all of my wire shelves. I'm a huge fan of these adjustable wire shelves. As you can see, lots of stuff. Put all of them in clear bins. Maybe I'll end up marking them, labeling them, but right now I can see through them so I know what's inside. And I decided to go ahead and put all like items in like boxes because they were scattered every which way. I'm really excited now because this room, while not super cute, is totally usable for me.
I am single-handedly keeping the wire shelf people in business. I also in here have a lot of clear bins. That way I can actually see all the junk that I have. And I have spent a lot of time trying to reorganize everything because you would not believe how many different places your girl was trying to keep like needles and thread, like 5 different bins of this fabric. Is honestly because I'm like running out of room in the closet to hang it all up. Also, honestly, full disclosure, a lot of this stuff is smaller fabric, so it's not like fabric that I could make necessarily a whole dress out of. Fabric that would be great for crafting. I like to keep this stuff folded and kind of stacked, and I like to keep it rainbow order because it looks nice and pretty. You can actually buy clothing dowel rods for these shelves. You don't have to do what I did, which is just get a dowel rod and drill a hole through it, add your string, and then hang this up. And all of this stuff right here, these are all pieces that either need repair. Well, this one, the hem is coming out, just needs like a straight stitch. Vintage dress I found of it. It's amazing, but she's missing a zipper. Of course, some of it is projects that I'm in the middle of working on. And what I found was I used to keep this in the closet, but now that I have it out and about, I can see it and I know that, oh yeah, before I start cutting into more fabric to make another dress, hello, let's get this finished first. Just more stuff, y'all. Just more stuff. Looms for weaving. Got my stuff from my Cricut cutter. Lots of doilies and embroidered pieces. Just kind of anything that I have that was sitting in a vase or a jar or a container. It's really helped me out to have my shelves fit for each one of these containers and have everything stashed and stored.
Again, being the visual person that I am, the clear bins, they really help me out because if I put it in a bin that was not labeled or not clear for me to see, I would have no clue what was inside.
So right down here, I have bins of roving.
So for this part of the video, instead of actually hitting record, I hit slow-mo. So for the next like 55 minutes, there's me talking very slowly about how I store roving. And while that may sound riveting to you, I decided not to torture you. So yeah, I just keep my roving organized in kind of two different categories. And I do this with yarn also. I have a bin for neutral colors and I have a bin for colorful colors. And again, because of bugs and little things like cats that like to get into my roving and the yarn, it helps me to stash and store these in clear bins on these shelves. I love to have all of my spies hanging up. It's easy for me to reach and grab, and it's also easy for me to just see it and know what I have. So that's why I have all of this pegboard here, as well as all of my spools of thread hanging up. I do have a full-length mirror and a half mirror in this room, just because as I'm sewing something, particularly clothing, I like to see how it looks. And I love to have all of this stuff out on this wall so I know exactly where it is. The pegboard was made by just me taking some frames from the craft store, taking them straight to the hardware store, having them cut the pegboard so that it fit perfectly.
Right next to my ironing board, I also love to have everything that I'm gonna need to have on hand. Like I said, I'm visual, so everything has to stay out and on a wall for me to see. I try, or I'm going to try, not to clutter my sewing table because it already gets cluttered when you're cutting the fabric and you're pinning things and you're sewing. So trying to keep that table clear means that I have to have a lot of things out on the wall. So I've got my scissors, my tape measure, buttons that just look pretty because honestly, I don't think I've ever made anything that required me to put a button on it. There's just little things that I just don't feel like doing. In the meantime, they look really cute. I think these are like spice containers. More patterns, and something I do love is having more clipboards full of like pattern pieces for a specific pattern, because pattern pieces can run away from you. Sketches or ideas for dresses are hung right here. That's this. And this is my sewing table. So this is just another wire shelf, as you can see, which is great because I have a lot more bins full of whatever supplies I might need in those clear bins. And I've also got all sorts of sewing books. I try to keep all of my sewing and fiber arts books in here. So those are all on the bottom shelf. The top of this is a big sheet of aluminum. It just happened to be something we had on hand. And I've covered the surface with a really raggedy looking sewing mat, or two sewing mats. This table needs dusted. And this is where I do a lot of the smaller cutting and pinning before I start stitching.
Y'all, thank you so much for letting me take you on a tour of my sewing room. I've had the sewing room for a while. Why have I never taken you on a tour before? It's because it's usually a hot stinking mess. And you know what? That's kind of like how a creative space should be. But for once it was organized, so I thought I would show you around. Those mannequins, by the way, were usually found vintage or thrifted, but I have added all of my favorite things in links below. And if you have any questions about anything that you've seen that I failed to kind of mention, please feel free to ask. So here is a little peek inside this special place that I love to spend time in and I hope to get back into really soon. Have a great day, guys.